Hey everybody, this is a little chapter from Robert J. Alexander's History of International Trotskyism book. It's titled International Committee of the Fourth International of the 1950s. For most of the decade following the split in the Fourth International in 1952-3, International Trotskyism was divided into two separate organizations, one led by Michel Pablo, the post-World War II Secretary of the Fourth International, the other composed of opponents to, quote, Pabloism, end quote. The anti-Pablo forces were more or less loosely joined in the International Committee of the Fourth International. The emergence of the International Committee. Events in the last months of 1953 moved quickly towards an organic split in the Fourth International. On October 3rd to 4th, a meeting was held in London of representatives of the British section of the International, the French majority group which had been expelled the year before, and the Swiss section. Sam Gordon of the Socialist Workers Party of the United States also attended, quote, individually, end quote. The meeting decided to set up a, quote, provisional committee, end quote, of two representatives, each from the French, British, and Swiss sections. At that point, what was being organized was a faction within the International. The meeting declared that, quote, the delegates declared their political agreement on the international perspective on the character of the Soviet bureaucracy and Stalinism. They decided to undertake together the defense of Trotskyism against Pabloist revisionism and the struggle against the liquidation of the Fourth International, end quote. They also agreed to prepare documents for submission to the Fourth Congress of the International. On November 7th to 8th, 1963, the Socialist Workers Party held a plenum at which it expelled the Cochranite faction. The International Secretariat sent a letter to this meeting after noting that the Socialist Workers Party had not yet submitted any critique of the documents for the Fourth World Congress. Their letter claimed that, quote, to build a faction under such conditions, then to bring it forth brusquely in the late of day, and then violently oppose it to the international leadership becomes frankly an unprincipled, unspeakable operation, profoundly alien to the traditions and nature of our movement, end quote. It ended saying, quote, avoid a fundamental political crystallization on this or that line before previous discussion between delegations responsible to your leadership and the International Secretariat and the International Executive Committee. Or the International Executive Committee. But above any other consideration, the unity of our international movement, the unity of your own organization, end quote. When the Socialist Workers' Party's leadership clearly did not follow its advice, the International Secretariat issued a, quote, letter from the Bureau of the International Secretariat to the leaderships of all sections, end quote, signed by Pablo, Pierre Frank, and Ernest Mandel, and dated November 16, 1963. It began, quote, the most revolting operation has just been launched against the unity of the International. The majority of the American organizations cynically defying the most elementary rules of our international movement, and its traditions as well as its leadership have just excluded by the decision of its plenum of November 7th to 8th, the minority which declares itself in agreement with the line of the International, end quote. After noting that Cannon and his associates, as well as Healy, had until recently supported the international leadership, the letter noted that, quote, their 100% about face of today dates only a few months back. How then to explain it, end quote. The letter answered its own question, quote, if they now act in this way, it is above all to safeguard the personal clique regime in the midst of their organization that they consider threatened by the extension of the influence of the International as a centralized world party. fixed on old ideas and schemas, educated in the old organizational atmosphere of our movement, they really represent politically and organizationally the sectarian tendency which recoils from the movement of the social democratic or Stalinist masses, or feels itself ill at ease within it. They further remain profoundly resistant to all real integration into a centralized world party. End quote. This letter then proceeded virtually to read the Socialist Workers Party out of the International Trotskyist movement. It said, quote, "The International was, remains, and will remain a political movement and a principled organization. It will not compromise on its principles. It will never permit the expulsions effected by cannon, nor those which Burns (Gerry Healy) end quote, is preparing in England. With all our forces, we ask the IEC to stigmatize these measures, to enjoin those who have taken them to immediately withdraw them, and to reintegrate forthwith the expelled members within their organizations. Any other road followed by anyone whatsoever could only place them outside our movement." End quote. Meanwhile, in addition to expelling the Cochranites, the Socialist Workers Party plenum had adopted, quote, "a letter to Trotskyists throughout the world," end quote. This document, after reciting a bit of the post-war history of the Fourth International, quote, restated, end quote, the fundamental principles of Trotskyism. It then proclaimed, quote, "These fundamental principles established by Leon Trotsky retain full validity in the increasingly complex and fluid politics of the world today. These principles have been abandoned by Pablo. In place of emphasizing the danger of a new barbarism, he sees the drive towards socialism as, quote, irreversible," end quote. Yet he does not see socialism coming within our generation or some generation to come. Instead, he has advanced the concept of a, quote, engulfing, end quote, wave of revolutions that give birth to nothing but, quote, deformed, end quote, that is, Stalinist-type worker states which are to last for, quote, centuries, end quote. After criticizing a number of specific acts of the Pablo leadership, including its support of the Cochranites, the letter said, quote, "To sum up, the lines of cleavage between Pablo's revisionism and orthodox Trotskyism are so deep that no compromise is possible either politically or organizationally. If we may offer advice to the sections of the Fourth International from our enforced position outside the ranks, we think the time has come to act, and to act decisively. The time has come for the orthodox Trotskyist majority of the Fourth International to assert their will against Pablo's usurpation of authority. They should in addition safeguard the administration of the affairs of the Fourth International by removing Pablo and his agents from office and replacing them with cadres who have proved in action that they know how to uphold orthodox Trotskyism and keep the movement on a correct course both politically and organizationally." End quote. This appeal of the Socialist Workers Party was soon answered. On November 23, 1953, a resolution forming the International Committee, end quote, was issued from Paris over the signatures of Gerry Healy, Bleibtreu of the French majority, Smith of the, quote, New Zealand, end quote, section, apparently Farrell Dobbs of the Socialist Workers Party, and Jacques of the Swiss section. It proclaimed, 1. We affirm our solidarity with the fundamental line of the appeal of the National Committee of the Socialist Workers Party to the Trotskyists throughout the world, and particularly with the definition therein of the programmatic basis of Trotskyism. 2. We consider as having forfeited its power the International Secretariat of the Pabloist usurpers, which is devoting its activity to the revisionism of Trotskyism, the liquidation of the International, and the destruction of its cadres. 3. Representing the vast majority of the Trotskyist forces of the International, we decide to constitute an International Committee of the Fourth International. We call on the leadership of all the sections of the Fourth International to establish relations with the leaderships which represent the Trotskyist program and the majority of the forces of the International. Every responsible cadre, every Trotskyist militant concerned with the unity of the International and the future of his national section must clearly and swiftly take a position as between the revisionist and liquidationist center of the Pabloist usurpers and the International Committee of the Fourth International." End quote. The 14th plenum of the IEC of the Fourth International, which met December 26 to 28, 1963, retaliated against the signers of the Socialist Workers Party's quote, letter, end quote, and the resolution establishing the International Committee. It resolved, quote, A, to suspend from membership in the International all members of the International Executive Committee who signed the split appeal which appeared in the Militant of November 16, 1953, or the appeal of the, quote, Committee of the Fourth International, end quote, or who support the appeals and endeavor to rally the sections of the International on this basis. B, to suspend from their posts in the leadership of the sections all those who signed these appeals or who support them and endeavor to rally the sections of the International on this basis. C, to leave the final decisions on these cases to the Fourth World Congress, end quote. The 14th plenum also decided to recognize as official sections the minority groups of the Socialist Workers Party and of the British section. Finally, it replaced Gerry Healy on the IEC and the International Secretariat with John Lawrence, and added representatives of the German and Dutch sections to the International Secretariat. Those who had launched the International Committee were able to gain some additional recruits. These included the exiled Chinese section based in Hong Kong and the Canadian section, although the Canadian group underwent a split as a consequence of this decision. Of course, the International Committee had the support of the Socialist Workers Party of the United States. An editorial in the Militant said that, quote, the organization of the International Committee signifies that the Fourth International has once again proved its historic viability. It shows that no force on earth, external or internal, can destroy it, end quote. The editorial concluded, quote, we hail the formation of the International Committee of the Fourth International because we are compelled to remain outside the international organization due to the reactionary Voorhis Law of 1940. We are all the more interested and concerned with the development of the Fourth International. The International Committee ensures the line of revolutionary continuity that extends from Lenin through Trotsky into the future victory of socialist mankind, end quote. The International Committee from 1953 to 63. The International Committee of the Fourth International did not hold full-fledged congresses such as those of the Pabloite group. Pierre Frank has noted that it, quote, really functioned not as a centralized organization, but as a faction with loose ties among its members, according to information supplied by comrades who took part in the International Committee. There were few international meetings of the committee, political positions often being formulated in the form of documents from national sections after exchanges of views between the committee's sections, end quote. However, from time to time, there were limited meetings of representatives of the parties and groups associated with the International Committee. For example, one such meeting took place in Paris in November 1955. It adopted resolutions on the so-called Parity Commission between the Pabloites and the International Committee, and on, quote, solidarity with the Algerian struggle for national liberation, end quote. The nearest thing to a worldwide meeting of the International Committee was a World Conference which met in Leeds in 1958. The leading role was apparently taken by the delegates of the Socialist Workers Party of the United States, whose principal resolution was adopted at the meeting. The Latin American delegates to the conference submitted several documents which were critical of the attitude of the Socialist Workers Party within the International Committee, particularly its allegedly, quote, federal, end quote, concept of the nature of the Fourth International, and particularly of the International Committee and of overtures which the Socialist Workers Party leaders had made for reunification with the International Secretariat. However, the resolutions submitted by the Latin Americans were not formally considered by the conference. One development within the International Committee, which was to have considerable future impact on the evolution of international Trotskyism, was the formation of a Latin American organization within its ranks. This resulted from a meeting in October 1954, which set up the Comité Latinoamericano del Trotskyismo Ortodoxo, Ortodoxo, I don't know if you think it's how you say H, like when you say Mexico, CLA, consisting of Nahuel Moreno from the Argentine POR Palabra Obrera, Humberto Valenzuela of the Chilean POR, and Hernandez from the Peruvian POR. The CLA, organized in March 1957, what it called the First Conference of Latin American Orthodox Trotskyism, which established the Latin American Secretariat of Orthodox Trotskyism, SLATO, which continued to exist until December 1964. Starting in 1957, SLATO issued a more or less regular publication, a strategia, I don't know how you say it, edited by Nahuel Moreno, and appearing in Buenos Aires. Although some other groups were nominally affiliated with SLATO, its major affiliates continued to be those of Argentina, Chile, and Peru. In April 1961, SLATO held its second meeting in Buenos Aires, where it paid particular attention to the phenomenon of Castroism in Latin America. It also adopted resolutions requesting the International Committee to publish all documents on the subject of Castroism and the Cuban Revolution, which had been adopted by the member groups of the International Committee, and calling for a general discussion of the Castroite phenomenon within the ranks of the International Committee. The position of SLATO was later summed up thus, quote, SLATO decidedly oriented itself to the perspective that the Cuban Revolution had provoked a decisive change in the relations of forces between imperialism and the masses in favor of the masses, with a leading role for the agrarian revolution and the armed struggle, and that a petty bourgeois revolutionary nationalist movement on continental dimensions, Castroism, had appeared. A correct line for the construction of Trotskyist revolutionary parties must take into account these new phenomena, in particular guerrilla war, incorporating them in the traditional program of Trotskyism, end quote. After first categorizing the Cuban regime as a workers' state, quote, in transition, end quote, SLATO soon came to regard it as a, quote, bureaucratic workers' state, end quote. As a counterpart to this definition, SLATO advocated a, quote, political revolution, end quote, in Cuba, as in other, quote, worker states, end quote. SLATO formed the core of what in the 1970s and 1980s was to be the Morenoist tendency in international Trotskyism. Pierre has noted concerning relations between the International Committee and the International Secretariat that beginning in 1956, the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the Sino-Soviet dispute brought the positions of the two groups closer on the question of the crisis of Stalinism. Moreover, on the problems of the colonial revolution, members and sympathizers of the International Committee, especially those in North America and Latin America, underwent an experience with the Cuban Revolution that was in many respects similar to the Fourth International's experience with the Algerian Revolution. From time to time, the International Committee issued general statements. One of the most significant of these was the Manifesto of the Manifesto of the International Committee of the Fourth International, bracket, Trotskyists, end bracket, on the Hungarian Revolution, published in November 1956. It proclaimed that the, quote, Hungarian people, arms in hand, had revolted against the native Stalinist bureaucracy and its Russian overlords. In the course of their heroic struggle, they have established workers' councils in several important industrial towns, end quote. It went on to argue that, quote, to destroy Stalinist bureaucratic oppression and counter-revolution, the Hungarian Workers' Council, or Soviet method of organization, which, as in Russia in 1917, forms the basis of the dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. The document appealed to the members of the communist parties to use the betrayal of the workers by their parties in the Hungarian situation to get rid of their Stalinist leaders. It also appealed to the Soviet armed forces, calling upon them to, quote, remember the revolutionary traditions of the Red Army founded by Leon Trotsky. Solidarize yourselves immediately with the gallant Hungarian fighters for socialist freedom organized in their Soviets, end quote. As negotiations progressed towards reunification of international Trotskyism, which ultimately culminated in the establishment of the United Secretariat of the Fourth International in 1963, the International Committee split. Some of its national sections entered the new United Secretariat. Others continued in existence as a rump international committee.